I think history explains the present. The scientists aren't gods, and they don't know everything. Keeping that in mind is a healthy way of looking at the present. I don't think that the public perception of the poultry industry is very good. You have to have a fondness for the birds, as they care very deeply about them.
Welcome to Unplucked, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast where we strip away the fluff and get real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. In this week's episode, we're going to explore the historical roots of poultry breeding and the scientific, institutional, and cultural forces that shape the poultry industry as we know it today. We get some expert insight from historian Dr. Margaret Derry, tracing the origins of hybridization, the role of the land-grant university system, and how industrialization reshaped not just chicken genetics, but the very identity of poultry science. This is our third in a three-part series of the history of poultry science and the role that our association and the discipline played in driving forward a vibrant global industry. Dr. Margaret Derry with the University of Guelph is not only an associated faculty at the Campbell Center for Animal Welfare in the Department of Animal and Poultry Science, but is also an adjunct professor in the Department of History at the University of Guelph. She obtained her PhD in history at the University of Toronto, and her research focus has been on the history of animal breeding, particularly the intersection of science, industry, and animal agriculture. Dr. Derry, it's a treat to talk with you in this week's episode. I'd like to start with how you got involved and learning your background and what initially sparked your interest in the history of animal breeding, and particularly poultry, as a line of inquiry.
Well, I've loved animals all my life, and I've loved art all my life. And somehow those two welded together in my mind as something to do with breeding. Breeding became to me kind of an art. And as an adult, I practiced art professionally, and I became a livestock breeder. I bred purebred cattle for 30 years. So when I went back to do my PhD, I was naturally interested in animal breeding. It was a subject that was not really sought after in history in those days, and this is very early in what we now know is a huge field of animal history. My doctorate was on the Canadian cattle industry. And from there, I went on exploring culture and the organization of breeding along the lines of understanding purebred breeding itself and where it came from, and particularly as it applied to cattle, dogs, and various breeds of horses. In 2005, I gave a talk at Yale, and this introduced me to, of course, poultry. And I became interested in it in terms of genetics. And I, after that, read much of poultry science, many, many articles in poultry science, and wrote a book on the culture and science of chicken breeding, basically from 1850 to 1950. And after that, I went on pursuing genetics itself. And I think I can thank chickens for introducing me to this much larger world, which has been very exciting.
Well, it's a great place to kick off a deep discussion. And you, I think, set it up rather well. The poultry science and poultry genetics and breeding's evolved dramatically over the past 100 years. And so from the historian's perspective, I'd love to know what you see as some of those critical turning points in that evolution, or some of those key stops along the way.
There are many, of course, points you could bring up, but I would make 4 points. The first being that the move from breeding truly, lines that breed truly, to hybridizing is huge. The second one is the emphasis on breeding for 2 separate industries, eggs and meat. Now, that sounds kind of obvious today, but it was not at all obvious for some time.
Sure.
And in fact, breeding for dual purpose in the chicken industry was really prevalent until well into the 1920s. And there are various reasons for that. One, of course, is the involvement in women in the grower-producer side of the industry. There was increasingly emphasis on eggs, and it was the only industry that really was selling the product. So it's kind of interesting that when you look at statistics, the Barred Rock outnumbered Leghorns probably over 4-1. They just completely dominated the poultry scene, even though most of the energy was going to eggs at the time.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth point I think I'd make is the importance of the Wallace family and Highline and the involvement with the corn industry. And the fourth, I would say the importance of Arbor Acres and Vantras and the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. So those are the four I would pick as being critical turning points.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting roadmap that you've laid out for us. So we're getting our time machine for a moment and go back to this idea of how science played a role. And as you kind of lined out that timeline, that historical timeline, some of those key landmarks, how did early scientific breeding practices influence the poultry industry we know today? I think you've given some really critical waypoints for us to focus on. If we go back in that early, those early stages you talked about, what was the role that you see science playing in influencing how those breeding and genetics practices evolved?
It's problematic to talk about scientific breeding. And when did scientific breeding start? I mean, are you talking about breeding for improvement? Are you talking about specialization? Are you talking about hybridizing? And I'd like to get into this in a little more detail later because I would argue that hybridizing is not any more scientific than breeding for lines, truly. There's no difference. It's a label that scientists like and that is caught on. So, what is scientific about hybridizing? No. Well, there's some real land grant act, of course, of 1862 and the Hatch Act of 1887, and those two worked together to create agricultural colleges and experiment stations. Although between that time and certainly after 1900, most of the work these organizations dealt with was related to crops and not animals at all. There was a little bit on poultry, but tended to be just, I mean, looking at breeding, it would be crossbreeding for meat purposes, kind of exploring really what practical breeders were already doing.
Hmm.
Little bit of work on feeding, but it was really not very important. By 1900, there were 12 colleges that did teach care, breeding, housing, feeding, and so on. But there were only two that had a full-time professor in poultry science at the time. I think the big change is in the Adams Act of 1906, which encouraged funding for agricultural research. And after that, you see full-time geneticists being hired, say, by Maine, Raymond Pearl, Dunn in Connecticut, 1919, and Goodale in 1913 at Massachusetts. Those three are particularly important to the story of poultry science and what they did. The other critical thing that the research centers did comes after 1900, which is with the rediscovery of Mendel's laws, because it encouraged experimentation with Mendelism. We'll come back to that because that is absolutely critical. As to the USDA, I see its role more as one of organizing and coordinating how the industry worked. It was something that poultry breeders were not anxious to have the government involved in any way. They used to call it the withering hand of government. This was particularly true with the hatchery industry, which was kind of an organization that came out of the International Baby Chick Association, which was founded in, I think, 1902. And this is with huge incubators, which were capable of hatching, say, 20,000 chicks at a time. And it created an industry in its own right, but it was businessmen that ran it. They weren't breeders, but they were very influential because they made the decisions about what genetics they would buy from breeders. And they, in turn, also hired what were known as multipliers, which multiplied the genetics. Then they hatched the eggs and sent them out to the producer growers. Well, they were very opposed to any organization by the government, and there was need for it. The regulation of what was going on in the baby chick industry was pretty bad. But the USDA did do important things in terms of trap nesting, contests, of course, ran the Chicken of Tomorrow. Not as great a role as what was going on in the colleges themselves. And by the 1950s, incredible changes where this is all going to back off because of corporate enterprise entering breeding. So I think that's what I would say the early background to it is. There's really not much to do with chickens. There's the beginning of geneticists in these organizations, but the change is going to come with Mendelism, the rediscovery of Mendel's laws.
Well, we'll come to that in a minute. I like that you mentioned the Adams Act in 1906, and, maybe not coincidentally, 2 years later, we saw the founding of the Poultry Science Association. And something you said earlier, Dr. Derry, really resonated with me as a kid who grew up with purebred beef cattle. So we have that in common. And somebody whose family hobby today is breeding purebred dogs. So I hear this phrase, from whether we're talking about cattle breeders or dog breeders. And I think it's applicable here. You mentioned it right at the top, art and science, right? You'll hear a master breeder, one of my mentors will talk about, the art and science of breeding. We're going to dive into hybridization specifically as I think one of those critical scientific waypoints that you talked about a moment ago in Mendelism. But I really would love to get your historical take on the evolution of the scientific aspect of this relative to the art of breeding. I think some of those, what you were talking about, the practical breeding aspects in the early, late 1800s, early 1900s. Maybe we were thinking about that as the breeder's art, so to speak. But I mean, there's a scientific aspect of that as well, right? Just there's exactly what you were pointing out of what are we breeding for? Is it a certain trait? Is it
Yeah.
that producer knew what they were trying to get when they bred X and Y together, in theory. They weren't just throwing some chickens together and hoping for the best.
I don't like the word scientific breeding.
Sure.
A lot of the breeding that the practical breeders were doing at the time, if you look at, say, Felch, who was a brilliant breeder and wrote a number of books about it around 1902,
Uh-huh.
and he set up a chart which involved crossing, hybridizing, inbreeding, all the standard things that are scientific.
Sure.
Then you had H. Stoddard, who had another system involving something like 20 different pens with careful inbreeding, outcrossing, inbreeding again to fix type. All this breeding was about lines that breed truly. They did hybridize, but then they would correct to outcrossing. And these things, inbreeding, outbreeding, hybridizing, crossing breeds, and so on, those standard ways of breeding have been known thousands of years, and they've certainly been written about as far back as the Romans and the Greeks.
Sure.
So there's nothing new about these concepts. And so that this is where I just kind of cringe at the idea of science. Is it empirical? It's carefully thought out, organizing attempts to breed for something. Then in one of my books, I wrote about the aims of breeding. There are many aims to breeding. Improvement isn't the only one.
Right.
And certainly the poultry industry was plagued by breeding for beauty
Mm.
for years. And some of the systems within the American Poultry Association, the Standard of Perfection, which actually the Standard of Perfection is the prototype for all purebred dog breeding, birds were bred to a standard. It was how well that bird matched the particular standard, not what the bird was compared to another bird. It was all the standard. And within those breeding systems, there were very complicated crossbreeding and terminal cross type breedings being done on birds like the bird rock. There was a double cross mating system that was designed to a line that produced the best females and a line that produced the best males. And if you cross those two, you didn't get anything very good. So it's the same kind of biological lock that you're going to see later.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of discussion about it. This is in the 1890s. Lots of people didn't like it because it was difficult. Lots of people thought it was stupid because there should be one standard, not all these double standards. It was all related to barring. And if males and females didn't naturally inherit the same type of barring. But a lot of breeders argue that no, this is wrong. Don't look at it this way. This requires a lot of skill in breeding. So it's a great teacher in how to breed.
Mm-hmm.
And how to aim for what you want to get out of it. So, okay, these guys wanted barring. They wanted colored barring. Other breeders wanted speed. The aim is all part of what the breeder is going to do in the first place. So these ideas, what is science about them? And the art of breeding, I think, comes in that breeders have a way of assessing an actual animal that is an art. And it's something that really you can't teach, it's experience, but a breeder knows when a breeder sees a good animal. And I would say that is true of any animal. If you're a breeder of horses, you know a good cow. If you're a breeder of cows, you know a good horse. So science did not introduce anything new that way.
I'm smiling because you asked this question, well, what is science? And, in this kind of context, I had a chance to visit the Library of Congress earlier this month, and there's this great placard on the wall in the main reading room that just reads, "Science is organized knowledge." And I think, that gets at what you're saying. What I'm hearing you say is that, a lot of these early breeders, these practical breeders, they were doing things that we ended up calling science. And so I want to get into this hybridization. There was this body of knowledge that you're describing really well that these artistic breeders, these practical breeders were doing. How did hybridization kind of come from this thing that was known for quite some time? It wasn't something that we just, showed up and, hey, the land grant system was invented and poof, it magically appeared out of the ether. How did it, though, kind of go from this thing that we knew about to becoming really integral into chicken breeding and becoming, really maybe the main thrust of what we were trying to accomplish?
We have to come back to Mendelism again. And actually, we probably should start with Charles Darwin.
Hmm.
Of course, Darwin's theory of evolution, as we all know, fascinated, irritated, did many things to people. It caught interest. When Darwin wrote that theory, there were not any scientists as we know them. There were what were called naturalists. And now naturalists were people that took an empirical interest in natural phenomena. That could mean astronomy, that could mean biology. They were empirically interested in the world around them. And they gravitated quite quickly to trying to understand evolution. And they developed experimental breeding standards. And of course, one of them was logically hybridizing. When you think about it, if you breed a horse to a donkey, you get a different animal.
Uh-huh.
Well, the naturalists wondered, well, is that a sign of evolution? Is that how evolution works? So they were interested in hybridizing and inbreeding types and crossing to see the varieties that they could get. And did those varieties tell you anything? They tended to work with plants, either to prove or disprove Darwin's theory. Then in 1900, Mendel's laws are rediscovered. They were actually written in 1865 and lost by 3 different naturalists/scientists in Europe. Well, once that was on the menu, the hybridizing just increased. Because now it was a question of trying to understand recessive and dominant characteristics, how you could produce them in animals by inbreeding, so you could bring out recessives, inbreeding so you could create dominance. And then they became fascinated, of course, with hybridizing, all in relation to understanding now Mendelism and Mendelism in relation to evolution. Because Mendelism suggested that evolution under Darwin didn't work that way, that there was no gradual move of species changing over time. The only way it could happen was mutation, because genes, they thought, were immutable. You couldn't change them. So they did a lot of experimenting back and forth and disagreeing over that. In 1906, the word genetics, or gene and genetics, was invented by Bateson in England. So now we call them geneticists and scientists. Pre-1900, historians label them as naturalists. So they're working with this increasingly, and this was going on at these experiment stations and colleges in the United States. They were going on in Europe as well. So we had the scientists, as I said already, the scientists, geneticists, biologists at the stations, and they decided that their vehicle of studying evolution, their vehicle of understanding Mendelism, was to work with chickens. So they did a lot of breeding of chickens, looking at crooked legs, skeletal problems, feathers, combs, stuff like that. Nothing to do with production, nothing to do with help any farmer, all about trying to understand Mendelism. And I would say that any chicken breeding that was done by scientists before 1930 had nothing to do with production. Nothing. It was all about evolution, all about Mendelism. Well, in 1908, a scientist named Scholl became particularly interested and focused on hybridizing. He started to study it and he gave it a label. He called it heterosis. Another scientist, D.F. Jones, between 1908 and 1917, started working with corn along the same lines. But he introduced something very new that had never been done before in relation to corn. And that was to see if he could use this method devised by scientists in order to prove Mendelism, in order to understand evolution. And he invents the double-cross mating system, which is the one that went on to Highline. But what happens out of this is the scientists had the disdain for practical breeders by that point. Practical breeders were so stupid because they didn't practice science, which meant they didn't hybridize. So the idea that science was hybridizing and science was only hybridizing became pretty set. I would argue that hybridizing is no more scientific than pure line breeding. And if you need any proof of that, just look at the dairy industry and what it's done over the last 100 years. And it is entirely based on pure line breeding. And yet you don't seem to see anything saying dairy cattle are scientifically bred. That isn't sort of a common statement to make. It's chickens are scientifically bred, and to some degrees, pigs are scientifically bred now because hybridizing.
Right.
How did it get outside the scientific sphere? It was cumbersome. It was expensive. It didn't work very well. It had marketing ability. When you hybridize, you have to go back to the breeder to replace it. You cannot take what you've bought and breed that together and get the same results. And that attracted corporate enterprise.
When you think about the historical figures, poultry scientists or breeders or others that we've talked about, you've mentioned several of them along the way, but I'm wondering if are there any figures in that story that you think are underappreciated for their contributions or folks that don't get enough press that are an integral part of the story?
I have one in particular, and that's D.F. Jones. I don't think you ever hear anything particularly about him, and he is absolutely critical to this whole movement of using hybridizing for agriculture. It's true, his main work was with corn.
Mhm.
It is even questionable whether that would have taken off without him, because there were experiments being done on true line breeding and they were coming along well. And there's some evidence that in the end, true line breeding would have worked better than hybridizing anyway.
Mm.
But it didn't offer the advantage of the marketing factor. Therefore, it didn't attract corporate enterprise to invest in research to make it work. So I would pick him.
Walking through this history of the industry and talking about the marketing and the commercialization and the growth and the changes, I'm wondering as you look back and have studied the industry, how's public perception of poultry farming, chicken farming changed alongside these advancements we've been talking about in the art and science of breeding? Have you looked into that as part of your research and what did you learn?
I don't think that the public perception of the poultry industry is very good. I think they're mystified by it, and I think one of the key reasons that a lot of these difficulties do come up is that it is so secretive.
Mm.
Now, I talked to geneticists, and I asked about, like, any movement of, sharing of how to breed particular lines by hybridizing, sharing information with other scientists and so on, and his description of the breeding industry was, it's an industry of thieves.
Mm.
So the secretiveness of it, I think, is damaging.
Mm.
It's damaging in a number of ways. The breeding companies do research. That research isn't necessarily shared with anybody else. Corporate enterprise took over research. So this, in the end, affected the experiment stations and the agricultural colleges because by, say, 1940, all the work that they did just went straight to the corporate enterprise people. Nothing went to farmers anymore. And in the end, that led to a contraction of research. And that's all part of the privatization of breeding, the privatization of research. All of those things make it secretive. So the public's, I just feel, is sort of blind and they don't like the way chickens are handled. Researchers really are very fond of chickens. They even name them. I mean, the research I'm talking about, when his hens get too old for the research, she takes them home, keeps them there. I mean, so and the breeders will say this: you have to have a fondness for the birds. If that became more broadly known, instead of they're just looked at as machines.
Yeah, I think you get into animal agriculture because you love the animals, and I
That's
tend to I tend to find that. So I like what you're saying there. I am one who believes, those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. So I like when I get a historian on the line to ask them to to pull out their crystal ball, if you will. So I'm going to ask you the crystal ball question. But if you look at the road ahead, and you think about today's poultry industry, are there lessons from history as you've compiled your research over the years that you think we should keep in mind for the future as we look to the poultry industry of the future?
I think history explains the present.
Mm.
Understanding the background helps you understand why we're at the present. Heterosis has been written about since 1908 with Shull and Jones. But there's another guy who's important to heterosis, and that's East. And he wrote in 1936. And what he said about heterosis in 1936 still holds today. I think that's a lesson for anybody coming into poultry. Heterosis is absolutely critical. It's the absolute foundation of the way chickens are bred, and we don't understand it. The scientists aren't gods, and they don't know everything. And keeping that in mind is a healthy way of looking at the present. It allows for questions maybe to come up. I think heterosis is a good example of what is known and not known and why these rigidity ideas have set in the way they have. As I said, before the corporate companies became interested in hybridizing, there were experiments going on, and there were breeders doing much the same thing with crossing and inbreeding and then outcrossing, but keeping to lines that bred truly. And it was much more promising than hybridizing, much more promising. The other was awkward and expensive. The only thing it had going for it was that you had a biological lock on the product.
Dr. Derry, as we wrap up our time together, I want to give you a chance to preview. If there's anything about your current research, you've referred to several of the books you're working on. I would be surprised if you're not working on something now, but is there anything about your current research that you're pretty excited about?
Well, I have a book which I've just about finished and is ready to go in on specialization, which I brought up with the chicken industry. And here I'm dealing with cattle, beef and dairy cattle, and I'm dealing across North America, Britain, and continental Europe. So I've tried to take in everything up to Asia, really, India. Continental Europe's way of dealing with specialization has historically been very different than North America, and Britain sits in the middle. Why this is interesting to me is that advances in genetics and technology, reproductive technology, actually work best in single-purpose breeding, and that is true in the poultry industry too. And we're at a position today, which I find fascinating, which wouldn't have been even dreamable 10 years ago. Reproductive technology in the form of reliable sex semen and embryo transfer. We've got a situation today where good dairy cows can serve both the beef industry, as well as the beef industry does now, and the dairy industry at the same time. What's interesting about it is that it certainly will change the beef industry. How it changes it is unknown. But a lot of people that are involved argue that the beef industry is going to look exactly like the broiler industry. The beef industry today are the only remaining natural farming there is around agricultural animals. Beef herds still roam the land, they still look after their calves, and bulls go out there and breed them. And they are the only agricultural industry where that is true. To some degree, sheep, but not the same way. And so we're going to see the disappearance of that if this projection goes through. So this book is finished. I'm just waiting to submit it to the press.
The ag economist in me is intrigued to read it because I would have taken it from the economist approach and say the beef industry is the least vertically integrated. And here are all the reasons why I think it would be very difficult to vertically integrate it. So I'm looking forward to reading this for a variety of reasons. Dr. Margaret Derry, our guest on a really thoughtful journey through the history of poultry breeding, commercialization, and all of the various entanglements. What a great depth. And as I mentioned at the top of the program, this is our third in a three-part series tracing some of this history, including some of the things that happened in the research lab. If you missed our conversation with Dr. Paul Siegel, I would encourage you to go back to listen to that. And then Dr. Susan Lamont at Iowa State University, go back and listen to those first two, and I think you'll really enjoy the arc of this story, looking at it from three different perspectives over a period of the last 100 years. Margaret Derry, the University of Guelph. Friends, I would also ask you, if you enjoyed this conversation, visit us and subscribe. If you didn't do so already, rate the podcast Unplucked wherever you listen to your podcast. Those two things really do help us find listeners who might also enjoy these conversations about poultry science and the various related topics. If you are planning on presenting at our PSA Pacific Rim Scientific Conference this October, we're just 2 weeks away from closing abstract submissions. Take advantage of the opportunity to present your research to an international audience. Our inaugural PSA Pacific Rim Scientific Conference is this October in Macau, and I know you'll want to be there. You'll want to tell your kids and grandkids someday that you were there the first time that PSA hosted its Pacific Rim Scientific Conference. You can learn more about the event at poultryscience.org. Find out about abstract submissions. If you haven't already registered, book your hotel reservations, all that information available at poultryscience.org. Just click on the News and Events tab, and you'll get all the information you need there. Until next time, on behalf of the Poultry Science Association, I'm Andy Vance.